Okay, so we are back now on the session of questions and answer session. I will now call on the panelists, aware that you are already started responding to some of the questions that are posted in the chat button, but suffice to say that I have a few questions for each of the panelists. I will start with Paul. Paul, could you please activate your video so that we can see you? I want to see all the panelists now on the screen. So I will start with Paul. I was just thinking, as a youth, what do you consider the best way for youth to engage in the Sustainable Development Goals? We know there are some restrictions, maybe in politics or in investments and all that. What can the youth, or the African youth for that matter, do to contribute to the attainment or achievement of the SDGs? Paul, please.
Thank you, Dr. Laide. Yeah. And again, apologies, I cannot turn my video on for this, but I hope you can follow through still. There are several opportunities that we believe young people can actually contribute towards this, and one such opportunity is actually to contribute to the newly established, the Great Green Wall of Africa, and kind of, bringing together different nations across the Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel region to restore parts of Sub-Saharan Africa from further degradation and desertification. So this is an opportunity for young Africans to actually come together and support livelihoods, agricultural activities, but also ensuring protect our biodiversity while achieving the SDGs by 2030. And another one, I think maybe advocacy is very strong, and I was seeing a lot of, like Lauren already mentioned, we have a very youthful demographic. So young people in Africa are already showing and standing up to style and shape how advocacy in Africa is perceived. So if we can actually keep on pushing for policy changes, keep on standing and speaking and calling out leaders who are either not stepping up to action or policies that are not working for people and for nature, then we are actually also helping the world, and Africa in this case, actually achieve SDGs. So I think advocacy and trying to work with these projects around Africa, they can really be a huge opportunity for us as young Africans to at least see that the SDGs are achieved in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for emphasizing the important role of advocacy and also starting something small from where you are in terms of being a model, a youth that is a model, positively thinking, bringing about positive change in our own little way. Thank you very much. In any case, the African population is a youth population, so we can actually influence policies by rising up to the challenge and knowing what we need. Now, I'm speaking as a youth, okay? Knowing what we need and also thinking about the future, knowing that these goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are actually for us. Imagine where you will be in the next 10 years. If you are in the university now, you will be out of the university. If you don't continue to be a lecturer or something, then you will be in business, you'll be a family person. What type of family do you want to raise? What type of future do you want to see? I think the time to start thinking of those things is just now. This is the time to take action. This is a decade of action. Thank you very much, Paul. I have now moved to Mr. Oyebisi. You said many things about what we didn't do correctly pre-COVID, and now COVID has exposed our vulnerability in no little way, in a big way. You talk about social protection, data, technology, all those issues. I want to ask, you represent the NGOs, network of NGOs in Nigeria, and you also have a relationship with some other NGOs in Africa. What do you think, what's the best way for NGOs to partner with governments or private sector to work together? I think about this in the context of current situation, especially during the lockdown in Nigeria. it was so obvious that we're not prepared, in that we didn't know the people who should be served in terms of palliatives. We don't know their number. We don't know where they are. We don't know how much we should give to them. It's like we don't budget for social protection. We don't budget for, we don't put facilities that will encourage data, internet usage, and all that. And now, we need private sector. We know that government cannot do everything, perhaps. So how can NGOs, be more active in this space so as to bridge the gap that has been created? Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Laide. I'm sharing my screen now. And yes, what we've done as Nigerian Network of NGOs is to look at some policy priority areas based on the lessons we've learned from COVID, and to link it to the national, to the economic sustainability plan of the federal government, and then integrate it with the SDGs. All right. Now, this will situate my response to your question, which is, how can nonprofits work with government and the private sector? One is nonprofit organizations must develop capacity. Capacity to ensure that they are able to analyze government policies and find ways of providing concrete evidence as to how it can be improved, implemented, and also monitored. The other is the deficit of trust that exists between, again, I'm using the word civil society now, and the private sector and government. By civil society, I'm bringing the Dr. Laides in and Professor Lanion, whom I respect so much, as academics, into that space, and saying there's a lot of distrust amongst the three of us that has prevented us from developing a multi-stakeholder approach to engage in many of these things. And I'll cite a quick example. On social protection systems, what if the sociology department in the University of Ibadan, all right, provides an analysis of social protection for policymakers to think through about? Then nonprofits provide data on how many people they are serving that are poor that need social protection. Then government sits down and say, what is this information telling us? And government is not saying, because it is coming from nonprofit, it is noise. Or because it is coming from the University of Ibadan, it is too academic. All right. So we have a government that sits down, looks at the noise as it were, because noise itself is knowledge. All right. And then brings it to development to say, how do we use this to develop a policy around all what we've heard? Then look at implementation. Which one would business implement? Which would civil society implement? Don't forget that nonprofits also mobilize resources. So we're just doing an analysis of how much about 130 organizations have spent from their own resources on COVID alone between the last 3 months of say May, June, July. Have spent 72 or 73 million naira. That's just 134 organizations spending 72 or 73 million naira to help citizens, providing cash, providing food, providing XYZ. And we have over 80,000 nonprofits in the country. So that's some resources that they've mobilized on their own, locally, without donor funding, to be able to address the issue. So, but we are missing that element because of that distrust and the silo, the way we've all worked in silos. So going forward, we need to, one, learn how to engage better, two, learn how to channel our policies, our research, and our noise into policy development and policy implementation. Now, this is a marathon, not a sprint. There's a need for us to unlearn, but after unlearning, there's a need for us to also take action. That antagonistic way of doing things must stop. We must learn to listen to each other, and that is what Karma has taught me. So when Karma came, I just said to myself, at this point, I need to listen to what others are saying, process that thought, and see how we can use that to develop and shape better policies that all of us, about 80–90% of us, would agree to. Over to you, Dr. Laide.
Okay, thank you very much once again telling us that it should not be we against them. One of the data you presented about food security, food security may improve maybe by 2021, but it's going to escalate and this is critical, especially in Africa, where we have the world capital of poverty and world capital of school children. We have world capital of international persons. So these factors will what do you think we should do differently in Africa to achieve the SDGs, please?
Thanks for that question, and apologies. Yes, the sound was a little wonky, but I think I understood what you're asking. The food security issue is definitely a pressing one. Again, a disconcerting one, a trend that we've seen for the past few years that has really been exacerbated by the pandemic. But I think there are a lot of solutions, particularly for the continent. I think in general, there was a big era of investment in agriculture, particularly in extension and training in the 70s and 80s. And from the 90s to today, I think that's really languished. So one of the things that I'd really like to see is governments renewing their investment and reinvigorating the agriculture sector as an area for development, particularly investing in extension to go out and work with farmers to make sure that they have access to improved seed for high yield crops, making sure that they can diagnose problems with their soil and that they can afford to apply inputs and that they have the right sort of dosage and timing of those inputs, things like fertilizer, getting greater access to irrigation. I also think a big challenge there that's really also an opportunity if you look at it through a positive light is that a lot of those products are not produced locally in country. A lot of them are imported, which makes them very expensive, particularly things like fertilizer and irrigation. But I think this is an opportunity for young people who have an entrepreneurial spirit to start building businesses to do things to produce these locally. So they wouldn't be as expensive as some of these higher cost imported items. You'd be generating local business, local revenue. You'd be supporting farmers. I think that's a great solution. And then the other thing I think that's really important is improving access to markets, particularly for women and young people. So we see that in many places across the continent, if you look at female farmers versus male farmers, you see a lot more men having access to maybe niche crops for international markets, things like cocoa, things that are highly processed and exported and dependent on having a large network of processors, packagers, shippers, to receive those higher prices. You see that women and young people tend to be selling a lot more in local markets, perishables like vegetables, things that are not traded internationally, and they're getting lower prices for those. So I think we need to close this gender gap in access to international markets to help raise revenues of farmers, which would also help with food security because then people can afford to, purchase more food. That's the other thing that I think is especially challenging is the high amount of hunger, particularly in farming families, which I don't think is something that a lot of people would expect if you're a farmer that you're going hungry, but it's definitely something that you see both in Africa and also Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much for speaking glowingly about Africa and also being optimistic that you have shown us today. So that's much from my end, and we now move to the participants. I'm aware there's already a conversation about data, and using the case of Nigeria, that Nigeria, the last census was conducted 2005 and 2006, and over a decade. Ideally, it should be every 10 years. But I was just thinking, which one is more important to government? To know the people they govern, or to conduct election every year or every 4 years? Because if you imagine that government budgets every year and the budget is supposed to be for people, or the people that they don't know, okay? So if you don't know the people you govern or you work with, how do you budget correctly for them? Which one should take priority? To know the people where they are so that if there's a problem, you can reach them, or to just go around and feel that use projections every year to say this number of people, and then we have elections and all that. So I don't know who would like to answer that. Mr. Yebisi, you already started responding to Professor Laning's comment on that, about when you mentioned that we should have ID card and all that, maybe social protection card like we have in other places. Lauren, I will come back to you. We don't have social protection in Nigeria, let me say, because there's nobody that can confidently go to a place with his card to say, I need his support. But that operates in US. Now, can we look at, because we are going academic now, we have to do that. In a country where you have that, and a country you don't have that, is there any difference when it comes to a pandemic? You'll come to that, Lawrence, but let me ask Mr. EBC. So what do you think we should do as a priority? To continue to have elections without knowing our people? Or what should we do?
So, Dr. Lydell, let me quickly mention that we have social protection, right?
Okay.
So, when you look at the NPower program, which is for the unemployed, right? It's a social protection system. We have the health insurance system. It is also a social
I'm talking about universal coverage.
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
All right. But also remember, without being a government voice, this is the first time we're having a social system that can help us capture, the vulnerable to some extent. You have the trader money that goes to the trader women or men, in the informal market. You also have some amount of money going to the poorest of the poor. That is the cash transfer that goes to, the older women and all of that in our country. Why I'm taking my time to explain this is so that we can contextualize this more properly. All right, and part of that is the money and also the school feeding program. All right, so all of that was the response that government was trying to give in terms of palliatives. I remember the money for this came from the Abacha loot. Okay, so it's not new money. It's money from the Abacha loot. Now, having said that, what we do not have is what you've just mentioned, that coverage that covers me when, for instance, the Nigerian Network of NGOs cannot pay my salary anymore. Can I declare unemployment and government gives me a certain amount of money, basic minimum for me to live? Okay, so we do not have that. Also, the pension system that we have is also more of a social protection system, but has it worked and worked so well? So these are the issues we need to interrogate. But like Professor Lanio has said, you don't even know, most times Nigeria do not know whether Dr. Laite or Oyebisi or Professor Lanio exists, except for the fact that they pay their taxes, so they know you guys, you are in the system. But how about the James, I'm just mentioning names now, the James, the Adiola, the Timothy? Do they know where they are? They do not. So we need a data system that helps us to know what exactly is Oyebisi doing, where is Oyebisi, what is Oyebisi's income, is Oyebisi vulnerable, and what can the state do to ensure that Oyebisi is protected from this vulnerability. That is the role of that social protection, and that is why we need a data that captures all citizens. So when we are born, when we die, and what are we doing between when we are born and when we are no more on the surface of this earth. We do not have that. But we now have a system that I am cautiously estimating and believing that if it works well, it helps us to address that, and that is the national ID card process that we have that has been on for like 10, 20 years. But now we're seeing the reality and the reasons for us to have that, including merging all our data together, from the one on my passport to the one on my driver's license to the one at my bank, my BVN, so that we now have a unique identity that can give data on where I am, what my economic status is, what my realities, and government can use that to plan. We're already going there. We should encourage. So if the school resumes now, I'm expecting that the university system would encourage their students to go get the ID card. I'm expecting that churches will start preaching to their citizens, to their adherents, to say, go get your ID card. To mosques, they should do that. to cooperatives, they should do that so that we all get captured. And once we are captured, another issue that comes up, data protection. How do we ensure that our data is not used wrongly? And that's why the data protection bill that will soon go to the National Assembly should excite all of us. Today is the last day for you to make any comment on that bill. These are some of the connections, that we need to start teasing in now. Over to you, Dr. Lai.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarifying the issue that we, as a country, or it's about Nigeria. Many countries in Africa who don't have a universal coverage, and we are here to advocate for that because we need that more than any other time before. But whether even when we have this, whether it will still be sufficient, it may just be a necessary condition, but not be a sufficient condition for overcoming pandemic and responding to pandemic. I don't know. Now at this point, I want to call on Lauren. U.S. has universal coverage, and we have seen in this system that even with that, it's not sufficient. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. In advising Nigeria to do things better, what would be your key suggestions in this direction?
Yeah, so I do not think it's true that the U.S. has universal coverage. I would say that our strongest social protection program is unemployment insurance, but that is definitely not universal. It's time limited, so if you're somebody who's chronically underemployed, particularly in this timing around the pandemic, it's something that you're only eligible for a limited amount of time, and then they sort of leave you alone with nothing. And it also doesn't cover the most vulnerable people within our population, particularly undocumented migrants. So not everybody in the US is eligible. And then the other thing that I think is particularly problematic in the US in the context of the pandemic is that we also do not have universal health coverage. So we don't have any kind of national health system like you would see in pretty much every other wealthy nation, members of the OECD countries, or the members of the OECD that you see across Europe. And I think this is a double-edged sword for the pandemic, because you see people who have lost their employment, they've lost their insurance, and they are getting sick with COVID, and they really don't have a lot beyond maybe some initial unemployment insurance that gets discontinued after some time. And the other big weakness we see with our unemployment insurance is that it's done at the state level, and in most states, the amount of money that they're giving is actually not sufficient for a family to live off of. So it's definitely an improvement and a help, but you're still seeing people who can't afford to pay rent, who are being evicted, who are becoming homeless while they're collecting their social services because the dollar amounts are insufficient. And this is especially problematic in a lot of urban areas in the United States where costs of living are higher. So I'm not sure that we're the best model. I would say look to Canada, look to Europe for perhaps some better models. But I do think I have 3 key recommendations. The first is that you have to get the financial revenues correctly. So in countries where you see really strong social services, universal coverage that are providing adequate services of the sort of level and ambition needed to people, you see that in general they have thriving economies and higher tax bases so that the government can afford to pay those social services. The other thing I would say you need is faith in government and faith in society. The other thing I think you see that's common across all of those countries is that there's a collective thought. Individuals feel that they're willing to pay in for the good of the common good, the good of the community, the good of society. They're paying higher tax rates because they trust that their government is going to use those funds wisely to provide the kind of services that people need. That's another big problem I think we see right now in the United States. Too much of our budget is going to the military, and a lot of people really feel strongly that that's not a good use of funds and that it should be going more to social services. I think in much of Europe you don't see that. And then the third piece relating to our last speaker is I think you need the infrastructure to effectively and efficiently distribute those benefits to make sure that you do have universal coverage. I think the movement to the national ID in Nigeria is a great step in the right direction on that. You've also seen countries like India, roll out national IDs to over 1 billion people very successfully. And I think the more that we see online banking, telemedicine, which has really advanced during this pandemic, the more feasible it's going to be to set up those kinds of systems to effectively count everybody, and whether it's payments or whether it's services like healthcare, actually deliver them to everybody to achieve that universal coverage.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the goal to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is to strive towards universal coverage. And thank you for the enlightenment that the U.S. is not a good example in this direction. So we'd like to encourage the U.S. to also embrace universal coverage. Thank you very much. At this point, I still want to take, let me inform us that Paul Mutuku is taking his permission to leave because he has another meeting. So I've already granted him leave. I just wanted to inform everybody. Let me see if I still have a question. Someone raised his or her hand earlier. I can afford one voice call. If anybody wants to call in, you want to use your microphone now to speak to every other person. You have a burning desire that you cannot, burning question that you cannot wait to for me to read. So you can say it now, please. But while waiting on that, the SDGs, especially the SDG. Okay, somebody, Sabah Ibrahim, you want to say something? Okay, you just joined. Okay, yes, I'll come back to Lauren, please. The SDG index for Africa. In the last 2 editions, there seems to be some decline in many ways. And it shows that most African nations, just like many parts of the world, may not be able to achieve these SDGs. So does that bother you as somebody who to run this analysis and monitor this progress?
It definitely bothers me. I also am very disturbed, as we heard in the comments from the Deputy Secretary General, that most countries were not on track to achieve the SDGs before the pandemic, and the pandemic has really sort of dramatically set us back a number of years and reduced the likelihood even further. I think the big challenge, particularly for low-income countries, landlocked developing countries, small island states, all of these different sort of groupings of countries where you see that people are highly vulnerable to whether it's climate scenarios, climate change, low income, lack of social service provision, is the lack of coming together as an international community to provide financing and funding for those countries to support achievement of the SDGs. The other group that I would say too is countries that are experiencing conflict. That's definitely something that keeps me up at night. In a country like Yemen or Syria, or even specific regions like northern Nigeria, how do you build from the ground up the kind of governance structure that you would even need to be able to effectively start implementing projects to achieve the SDGs? I think there are just some places where conflict and poverty and social incohesion are just so entrenched that they need a lot of support. And I'm not seeing the international community really come to deliver on this. I know we've been talking now for decades about countries achieving that objective of 0.7% of GDP for overseas development assistance. I think if we could get there, that would, really go a dramatic way in helping countries achieve the SDGs. And then the other place that I would point fingers is actually the world's ultra rich. One of the other things that we're seeing in the US, which is also very disturbing, is despite the fact that we have new records of unemployment, joblessness, new records of people going into poverty, losing health care, facing eviction, becoming homeless. We've also seen a few key tech companies on the NASDAQ and the Dow and the stock market achieving very, very well. And so in the US, the world's wealthiest people, people like Jeff Bezos, for example, who's the CEO of Amazon, have actually made millions and millions and millions of dollars off of the pandemic, despite sort of this abject destruction of the lower class and the working class. So I think the other place we really need to see action is holding some of these ultra wealthy individuals accountable, charging them higher taxes, and seeing what we can do with them to leverage some of the financial resources to achieve the SDGs. For me, I think it really just comes down to lack of access of financial resources. I mean, I think countries know what they need to do and the willpower is there, and that's really sort of the obstacle.
Thank you again, Lorraine. Don't you see that in the face of pandemic, as we do have now, it seems that countries, instead of supporting other nations, they will prefer first to look at their own situation. So does that inform us that each country will need to take their own development in their own hands and not depend on foreign aids or support? What's the way forward?
So I definitely think that's what we are seeing happening. But I actually think this is the first time we've seen it in the face of a global crisis. And it's a disturbing trend that I really do hope is reversed. I think there are lots of really successful examples of multilateralism, collaboration, countries coming together to address really difficult challenges. Particularly in health, I would use Ebola or HIV/AIDS as examples, where there really was this feeling of the problem is not addressed unless it's addressed everywhere. A threat in one country could spill over to another, and therefore, we all care and want to come together to work to address this. I'm not sure why the opposite is true of COVID-19 for perhaps the first time ever, the only example I can think of. I don't know if it's because in general our global system is moving more towards nationalism and a little bit away from multilateralism, particularly with leaders like Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, really preaching, focus at home, focus on our own country. But I don't think that's going to be a successful path forward. I think too many of our issues, whether it's health or whether it's all of the SDGs more broadly, biodiversity, climate change, poverty, the need for reasonable incomes to stem migration. I think too many of our issues cross national boundaries, and that this looking inward and this sort of every man for himself mentality is not going to get us to achieve the SDGs. I think a collaborative multilateral model is definitely the more successful route to go.